The topic that we have addressed, or the topics we have addressed in this meeting, cannot possibly be dealt with and cannot be possibly sort of attacked properly without good, solid result from research, from science. That's something that we need really to know and understand very clearly. Results of science, which is very well done, and results that are not manipulated, are not distorted, and are not repressed. It is clear that, I think on the presentations, that human activity is responsible for global change, and I use the word global change because it's a coin that has two sides. One is climate change, and global warming on part of climate change. The other side of the coin is the loss of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity. And each side is equally important, certainly. And climate change has been more sexy, to put it in the words of the governor of California, because on one hand, we feel it more clearly, it impacts us more immediately, and finally, it's also an easier phenomenon than the loss of ecosystems to understand. So if the issue of global warming has become a shock and is becoming interpreted more as a shock, particularly since the film of Al Gore's, and particularly that the film got a statuette that I think played a very great role in impacting people, at least in the US. This issue of the loss of ecosystems is really going to be, and is already, the second shock, if you want to call it that way. Is not yet recognized as global warming is, but is certainly going to be as central in the next few years when things start sort of being digested as the global warming problems have been digested by society. I have three messages. The first message is that biodiversity loss is not just the loss of Latin binomials, the loss of a spider or an orchid, is the loss of ecosystems and the loss of services that ecosystems provide. Services like the food we get, the timber we use, the fibers we use, but also services like the capture of CO2, the capture of rainfall, the maintenance of soil in its place, etc. Some of those services we have valued, like food and timber. Other services where either we don't value, we don't know how to value, or we're starting just to value them. But all of them are strictly and directly linked to human well-being. And this is something also very important. As Stephen Schmidhenny mentioned this morning, little had changed ever since he was present at the Rio meeting in 1992. And he was speaking about climate change. Well, the thing is that in 1992, as you know, it was for the occasion of the Convention of Biodiversity. And I can say that the goals of the Convention of Biodiversity have really not been achieved. Not only there has not been slowing down of the process of loss, but the loss of biodiversity in these 15 years or something like that has not stopped. On the contrary, it has increased very greatly. So we have a problem here. Now we have data that shows how much we have lost, not only in those 15 years, but even before. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a study that comprised about 16,000 scientists from all over the world and took about 5 years, provided some of these results. I'm not going to go into them by detail, but I can tell you that of those ecosystem services, about 15 that were evaluated, only 3 have been maintained or increased, and those are agriculture, food, timber, partly, and partly fiber. The rest have gone down and are being used unsustainably. Jonathan Lash mentioned some of the problems that have happened with ecosystems, with the loss of coral reefs, mangroves. We heard what's going on in oceans a moment ago. We are losing about 1 million hectares of forest a year, or probably more. The rates of extinction of species have been pushed up by 2 orders of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude, and we are really generating the 6th great extinction of species in this planet. So we have a huge, huge problem there that we need to know better. We need to assume in a much better way and really make it part of all the actions that, together with global change and climate change, and global warming, are going to be developed. The second message is that how are we going to feed the over 9 billion people by 2050, which that's about 50% more people than is living now on the planet, will determine greatly how much biodiversity and how many ecosystems are we going to maintain, both in the ocean or in the oceans, as well as in the terrestrial systems. In consequence, with that impact of agriculture and fisheries and aquaculture, most of the conservation of ecosystems will have to take place outside natural protected areas, as Mark Plotkin mentioned this morning, and I agree completely with him. So that means also that we'll have to manage ecosystems, to really intervene with them, do some kind of gardening, planned gardening of the planet that will certainly, it'll mean losing some species, but preserving the functions and the services that those ecosystems are providing to us. And that means something very important. We'll have to work with people the people who owns the ecosystems or who depend from the ecosystems. And this is not something easy. It's much easier to put a fence around 200,000 hectares of a forest and impede the entrance of people. But when people is there and they own those areas, you have to work with them. You cannot simply chuck them out of those regions. And this is something which we'll have to learn to do. That means interdisciplinary research, certainly of a very complex nature. In that sense, that there are complexities, but there are also lots of opportunities. And I will mention, for example, the kind of things that are happening in Mexico in terms of the communal forest enterprises. 80% of the forests in Mexico are owned by indigenous and rural communities, 80% of the forests. These are not private, these are not national, these are owned by people. And those people are within the 20% poorest people in the country, are the more marginalized socially, economically, etc. Now, but there are some examples, about 500 communal forest enterprises that are extremely successful. 50 of them are certified internationally as sustainably used, and they have developed enormous technologies, and they have adopted technologies to really not only sell timber in like logs, but also convert them into furniture, etc., which gives them really good conditions of living. So there are many examples in which we can combine the solution of a social problem with the solution of the preservation of the natural capital of a country. This natural capital is as important as the financial capital or the infrastructure capital or the human capital of a nation. And it's just now that we are starting to recognize the value of that natural capital, like, for example, with the sinks of CO2 in forests, having the markets of CO2 or giving them value as water sinks as well for the provision of water to keep drinking water for cities and villages, etc. certainly there is much here to do in terms of basic science in order to understand those ecosystems, how they react to different human activities, how can we keep them, which functions are the ones that we need to really keep, and we have large chunks of ignorance there that can only be solved by basic science, which will be absolutely essential to generate the criteria that will give value to these services. And speaking of value, Mr. Gilbert Grosvenor yesterday was mentioning that we need to know to love, but we need to know to do much more than love. We need to know to manage, to preserve, to use sustainably, which is really what really matters enormously. I think it's important to, in this case, to point out that some of the best examples of knowledge about biodiversity in the world occur in Latin America. The Humboldt Institute in Colombia, INBio in Costa Rica, and CONABIO in Mexico are top examples of national efforts in order to gather information, know it, and put it to service in their countries. In the case of CONABIO, is the transformation of basic fundamental science into intelligence to generate laws, to generate normativity, and to help decision-making in the area of environmental issues, particularly managing of natural capital. In the case of CONABIO, for example, the information it has provided to prevent forest fires is now being used in Central America. We have trained people for Central America. It's being used by Europe. The Europeans have adopted the technology that was developed there in order to apply it in that place, etc. What I say here is that we need to support these efforts in Latin America, first to bring them forward, but second, that knowledge and that capacity is spread in other countries in Latin America that do not have it. I would finish this point by saying that there's no way to deal with sustainable development if one is not dealing properly with the natural capital. Simply, we cannot move forward, and doing that will require a lot of basic fundamental research. I will finish with two commentaries. First is something I say and do with trepidation in this country, is that I think that the most important threat and challenge for humankind now is not terrorism, is global change. And this is something that we have to really face as a generation, because no matter what we do, if we don't face this challenge in a proper way, there is nothing to be keeping from terrorism or other human idiocies in the future. And I'll finish with a saying or a phrase by Albert Einstein, which I think applies very much to the kind of thing, to the kind of attitude that we must have, is that, and I quote him, "We cannot change the problems we have created using the same way of thinking that created those problems." Thank you very much.